Hi again, listeners, and welcome to another Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, today we are talking about adult animation.
Yes.
Or adult animation.
Yeah.
Or another way of saying that. So, how do you understand the term and how do you approach it?
Okay, so I think the starting point for adult animation is so Paul Wells writes that the idea that animation is an innocent medium ostensibly for children and largely therefore dismissed in film histories has essentially inhibited the proper discussion of kind of animation in relation to representation. Okay. And this is obviously a dominant kind of area of animation studies, animation in relation to childhood and children as a medium for children. And obviously we're interested in what we mean by adultness and qualifying adultness, which is often considered animation's other. It is for children. The other thing it's for is for adults. And so adultness is the weird other, right?
Yes. If adult animation is the subcategory of animation, that implies that animation isn't for adults.
Yes, it's something else.
Generalized form.
Yeah. So we might begin by thinking about language, so strong language, taboo themes, anything that's kind of confrontational, maybe heightened vulgarity, sexual content, playful innuendo, and that allows us to make discriminations about certain kinds of films, certain kinds of text, and also certain kinds of filmmakers and animators. So Ralph Bakshi, for example, is the kind of quintessential adult animated director, making a film like Fritz the Cat in 1975. Okay,
yes.
There are other ways of qualifying this through that lens. So Japanese hentai pornography, so kind of erotic anime that's available online that often co-ops animated characters into sort of sexual positions. We might add in digital deepfakes that had an early life within pornography. Yeah. So these kinds of graphic scenes of sex and ultra-violence.
Right. So that would be the adult animation.
That's adult animation.
In the same way we have the adult film section in blockbusters in old movies now.
Yes.
So that kind of
rude and crude is a good way of describing
it. And by the very nature of its subject matter,
yes.
Excludes the presumed children that can be watching it otherwise.
The default audience, which means that adult animation does, by virtue of its otherness, something else entirely.
It crosses a line that makes it for adults only. Okay,
yes.
So that's one way of thinking about this term. What else?
So I guess when I've talked to students about this, kind of pushing it beyond rude and crude, obviously there are perhaps ethical questions, animation doing things ethically, which, there's a question of purpose and of audience, but also of kind of site-specific animation. So which essentially means, okay, so adult animation could be one of maybe half a dozen things. Maybe it is maturity. It's vulgarity, but maybe it's maturity over vulgarity. So it's animation that maybe deals with serious subject matter. So we could be thinking about animated documentary. We could be thinking about A Waltz with Bashir, something that maybe works through personal catharsis or trauma. So it could be an animated documentary. It could be a series of films online under the banner Home Truths, which are about domestic violence that are animated. So serious subject matter.
So these would be films that, through the sophistication of their ideas, might not be aimed at children.
Yes.
Right.
Second way we might define it would be kind of satire or parody. So animation is a form of social criticism. So the way it lampoons popular culture. So a spitting image, maybe it has an adult register, Simpsons, Family Guy, less vulgar, more the naughty. So a kind of social criticism element to it, parody, so forth.
Right. So we sound like we're starting to try and classify it again into all these different subgenres.
Yeah.
I'm feeling impish because we're recording this at the end of a number of days here at the BAF conference, and my mind's gone mad, frankly. When we talk about the politics of all this, with women's cinema, that implies normal cinema isn't for women. The category is used to both to create a subcategory and also to say something about the original.
It's a
category.
form of distance, yeah.
When we talk about children's cinema, we do the same thing, right? That implies that cinema in its basic form wouldn't necessarily always be for children, but children's cinema is. Why are we doing this the other way round with animation?
It's a good.
And if we're doing it, why are we doing that?
Well, we kind of talked about these exclusionary tactics, so adult animation being part of a process to exclude the child, and so we kind of over-theorize and over-determine the adultness, just simply because historically, let's say, or the common consensus is that animation has often been for children.
Yes, I would say this latter is true more than the former, though, because my understanding is that, there's like animated documentaries from the early age and things like that, so it doesn't work historically.
No, it doesn't.
That animation was born, it was for children, and then Ralph Bakshi came along in 1974 and thought, why don't I make it for adults?
Exactly. This is a constant debate that we, me, you, all of us have had on social media and conferences, and in that even Disney, who has done a lot who has been criticised for constraining, let's say, a very experimental and creative form into this hyper-realist practice and set of representations, implies a couple of things. One, that realism can't be political when it absolutely can. Secondly, that realism is the path of least resistance, which it definitely wasn't, and that animation wasn't. The animation sort of became for children because of Disney, when actually even in the kind of 30s and 40s he's talking about his films as for adults as well, and for families actually. So we can try and broaden it out to answer the question of why we are doing it the other way around. And people have approached it in relation to kind of genre, so thinking about comedy and humour. So are we just, maybe when we talk about adult animation, we think about registers of comedy. So there are films that are not funny, like Beowulf, the 2007 Zemeckis film. Right. So that's an adult film, but it's not adult. But hey, Batman the Animated Series is a serious animated series that is kind of... So you can kind of connect adultness to genre. Style, I think, is something that is clearly... When we talk about Disney co-opting the form of animation into a hyper-realist style... we're sort of making assumptions that hyper-realist style is kind of making things for children. So adult could be relating to kind of less realist, experimental stuff, more grotesque, avant-garde, but it also could be like Ren and Stimpy, where the characters are a little bit kind of loose. And the last category is perhaps one that helps clarify some of these things, which is about animation's relationship to exhibition and distribution. So the places where we see it, so museums, art galleries. I'm really interested in, and certainly scholars like Malcolm Cook are interested in, animated advertising and music videos. So the music video, very recently, a lot of the Beatles songs were repurposed with animated music videos over the last couple of years. They could be argued to be adult because they are not. People aren't paying to see them at the cinema. They are watching them online, or they're not fitting into some of the other categories. They're just animating to a song. I'm really interested in relation to propaganda and social purpose. So a group of films in the 30s and 40s where Disney and Warner Brothers have got contracts with the government to make propaganda shorts. They are making shorts about the Nazi enemy. They are making the story of menstruation. Warner Brothers are creating a character called Private Snafu, who is a soldier, and these films are not being shown at the cinema. They're being shown they're being shown for soldiers. They are kind of educational videos, and they're about processes of indoctrination and I guess kind of looking after your tools. There are films called Fighting Tools, Private Snafu short called Fighting Tools, which is like, you should really use your tools correctly. So there's a kind of issue of function. Malcolm has talked about it in relation to kind of useful animation. So when we think about adult animation, what we need to do is think about circulation of text, production, and consumption. Are we looking at libraries, museums, different kinds of professional organisations? Does it have a pedagogical function? Is animation being used for science, educational videos in schools, for educational? So adult is something that we kind of start with the knob gags and the rude and crude, and start to sort of democratize it a little bit and think about how adultness seeps into lots and lots of different spaces to maybe flatten the category a little bit, but in a productive way, maybe to not exclude children, but think about how children are being addressed in school through adult animation.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So it sounds like sort of anyone interested in writing on this or thinking more about this has a kind of a question to ask of themselves and what their work is doing that's not dissimilar to the kind of work done in things like, the study of the women's film or something like that, which is that, and we kind of play with it. So on the one hand, it feels very tempting to just get rid of this category because it seems like it's embedded with all kinds of assumptions that we actually would challenge. Animation isn't for adults or children; it's for everyone or whoever it's aimed for. So on one level, you kind of want to do away with the category because it seems it's doing things that are a bit pernicious, in the same way that women's cinema is doing things that are a bit pernicious. At the same time, we actually don't get to decide how these terms are used as scholars. So as much as it is tempting to try to get rid of them and use different words, actually it might be better just to see how the words are used, and to use that to ask a series of questions about what it means to be adult, or what it's saying about the notion of adulting, by examining such categories in all the different ways that you've so productively described. Very quickly then, any kind of go-to intro to adult animation texts, or are there just a few things from the various categories you've described?
I would perhaps give two. So I think Kirsten Thompson and Malcolm Cook's book on animation and advertising, I think, is a good way of thinking about the category of useful animation, and the way that histories of animation are kind of histories of advertising are kind of almost the history of animation, because in advertising you see stop motion animation, you see silhouettes, experimental, you see cell animation, all that kind of stuff. So I would say their book on animation and advertising, and then perhaps in relation to Carl Cohen's book Forbidden Animation is a really good way of thinking about the sort of rude and crude, but how that maybe taps into questions of race as well. One of the things we haven't really talked about is adult animation in terms of the pernicious way that the racial other is represented. So maybe Forbidden Animation, and then Michael S. Schul and David E. Wilt's book Doing Their Bit, Wartime American Animated Short Films, the idea that animation was enlisted into the war effort, which is kind of a nice way of thinking about it.
Wonderful, thanks for that, Chris. Good introduction to a thorny but important term. So yeah, thanks for that, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye.